Welcome everyone. I'm Eugenia Vilarchao, a Science Officer at the European Science Foundation and part of the ACCTING coordination team. Thank you for joining us today in the webinar of Engaging Vulnerable Groups in Building Resilient Futures. This webinar is a joint initiative of the EU-funded projects Future Resilience, ACCTING, and Region for Climate. And it aims to raise awareness on the importance of involving vulnerable populations in the framing and design of policies and activities to build resilience. We have seen all too clearly in recent events how vulnerable groups are more impacted by the effects of a climate crisis, while they are often left out of national and international climate policymaking. So to build truly resilient societies, we must prioritize actions that address the needs of those that are more affected and most at risk. And this means to actively involve vulnerable groups in defining adaptation strategies and co-creating solutions that not only strengthen their capacities, but also foster inclusive resilience. So today, our three speakers will explore further the why, what, and how of making this a reality. We are looking forward to their insights, and as mentioned before, we have a very tight agenda for today. So we will welcome now our first speaker, Matthias Barberis. He's a researcher at EFIS Center in Belgium and the coordinator of the Future Resilience Project. Matthias has a PhD in social sciences and more than 10 years of experience in the field of sustainability, resilience, and innovation policies. He's actively involved in projects oriented to digital and green transformation, as well as impact assessment. We are excited to hear his insights today, so I will give the floor to Matthias now, who will share his screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenia, and good morning to everyone. And so I'm just going to share the screen. That should be it. So today I'm gonna present one big topic, which is marginality. And I think it's a topic that sometimes is a bit left aside on different fronts, from policymaking to how we design actually different strategies to build resilience. And this is the idea of the webinar, also to start exploring about marginality and vulnerable population. And I would like to start with a presentation about fragmented cities and how marginality and vulnerability evidence in these kind of settings. But before that, I will quickly present the Future Resilience project that I'm coordinating, and the project aims actually to strengthen European economic and social resilience through an enhanced ability to adapt and quickly respond to future crises. The project is actually building on the policy area of knowledge valorization, and we are looking to propose that different kind of stakeholders work on designing policies based on evidence, engaging with the society, but also trying to address uncertainty. That means that people need to think in terms of anticipatory governance and try to develop solutions A, B, or C for different kind of scenarios, so X, Y, Z situations. The project is based on 10 future resilience labs that you can see on the screen, and you can navigate on the project website. These labs are actually working on different challenges. They are applying foresight methodologies and other strategies to work with different type of stakeholders. And the idea is that at the end, they will come up with the solutions to tackle these challenges and build resilience in the long term. But all the labs are embedded in different kind of settings, urban settings, working with the private sector, working at regional level as well, or national level. But the idea is a bit, when we think about resilience, there is always the need to understand the context. And the talk that I wanted to present to you today is about fragmented cities. So when we talk about fragmented cities, we are talking about different type of urban spaces that are marked by divisions, whether they are ideally, technically from the initial point of view, when they started talking about fragmented city, there was this idea of the physical divisions of the city, but nowadays we are turning into more also social and economic divisions also within the city that is characterizing how cities are fragmented nowadays. And when we think about also urban planning, sometimes urban planning could address this fragmentation, but sometimes there are some interventions that could reinforce this fragmentation. That could go through resource distribution, some spatial segregation like gentrification processes, or inadequate infrastructure that could be used for doing urban interventions. All these vulnerabilities could also be strength that could be leveraged for building resilience. And here you may think, okay, but you are talking about urban planning, so you're talking about buildings. But we need to understand that how we live the cities is also embedded in how we design the cities and who is involved in the city design. So let's move a bit on the discussion. So how the margins are evolving. So if we think there is a circle or a dot there, and we can think what are the margins of this circle or a dot. But then the question would be how this dot is embedded in a bigger matrix that could be a city. So this is an artistic, I have it here in front of me. There's an artistic representation of Rio de Janeiro. So where this circle dot is embedded in a bigger city matrix, this is the question that we should think about how we think about the margins. So defining the margins in urban planning, if we think, for instance, of how the different planning of the cities were designed at the beginning when the cities were planned, we can think about the peripheries of the city as the initial margins. We can think about fortress, and the fortress were sometimes limits of how we can define who is inside and who is outside. We can think, for instance, Rome here in the white and black picture, and there were like some areas that were not built, which is now they are built. Or, for instance, how different limits were divided by a river, like this other presentation here in Italy. But today, if we think about the margins and how the margins evolve, we can find new types of urban margins. And I brought different kind of pictures here. Some of them are from Europe. One of them is not. So this one below is a favela in Rio de Janeiro. But then we can think new urban margins about migration, homeless people. And I wanted also to bring this example of the Dana in Valencia. And I want to quote here one of our researchers from the group, Fernando Garcia from the University of Cartagena. He posted recently a Twitter very timely about how, for instance, the use of the not the first floors, the ground floors of the buildings may need to change the way they are used in the urban planning, because of people may not want to live there any longer because of what happened in the Dana. So this is also a reconfiguration of the margins. So this could be a new margin inside the city. So we don't need to go all the time to the periphery, or sometimes we don't need to think like margins could be also in poorer neighborhoods, sometimes even the towns outside the big cities that are not very well connected with transport could be also a different way of margins. And this is not about poverty, it's about just people living outside of the city. So sometimes when we see the margins, we see places where many of the challenges that we see today may emerge and be more visible to people that want to see them. But sometimes the problem is that all these margins are not visible to the people responsible of making policymaking or influencing policymaking, but also to some people that may just ignore that there are some of these margins around us. So sometimes we don't need to go into these peripheries, but we need to sometimes change our way of thinking and change the lenses, the epistemic lenses and framings that we may use to understand what is a margin and what is vulnerability. So from this idea, the idea is now that we move into how we understand vulnerability in the context of how we build resilience. So in terms of societal resilience, I don't want to go into the definition of societal resilience, but into one of the factors that when we build resilience or when we build this ability or capacity of communities, there will be always shaped by societal pre-existing conditions. So we are talking about these structural and emerging vulnerabilities, but also about the developed capacities by different kind of people. So we need to also to think is, what are the capacities that vulnerable populations could bring us into building resilience in the long term? Some examples of vulnerabilities that could be analyzed are could be, for instance, here is quite basically divided into society and economy, but of course we can go deeper, and I will arrive to that. So you can read there some of the typical vulnerabilities on the society and on the economy that could influence how marginalization is deepened sometimes in the society because of the policies that we develop in all these areas. But then there is one concept that is very important, is differential vulnerability, which is that not all the groups are equally exposed to hazards or potential risks, and just not all of them will have the same resources to face one or multiple crises. And this is very important because we cannot just create comprehensive policies that this one policy will fit everyone, but we need to acknowledge that there are different groups in the society, and we need to design policies for each and all of them. In the Future Resilience Project, what we have done is we have thought about the typically impacted areas of different type of crises, which are usually these underlying factors or vulnerabilities of different type of risk. And those are potential areas where we can actually intervene and work then with different type of group. So as you can see here, before we were talking about society and economy, but here is a bit more disaggregated into different kind of vulnerabilities. And the idea is that the research and innovation system, so as we said, we are part of the knowledge valorization policy area of the European Commission. So how can we actually use existing knowledge to strengthen this kind of policies? So I wanted to bring some examples. Very basically, we have 3 of the labs of the Future Resilience that they are working on social integration. So I will invite every one of you to check on our website. We have some news, and also there are the lab description where you can navigate a bit more on how they are working with different type of social resilience and social integration. But I wanted to show you the case. So when we talk about margins and different ways of building the city, we have here in Argentina one of the more poorest neighborhood, Villa 31, Villa 31, sorry. And then you have the city of Buenos Aires on the other side of the train stations. There were some projects to regenerate this neighborhood. You have also a highway going through that. And they change a bit the face of that. So it's not that just this intervention is solving the problems of marginality, and it's not solving all the problems, but this is a step forward to just giving a new face to the town and just recreating new strategies within the neighborhood, giving more visibility, giving more a different concept of how secure this neighborhood could be for people looking at the inhabitants of the neighborhood. Another case that I wanted to bring also in terms of framing vulnerability, because we need to think about how we approach marginalized population. So this is a project also funded by the European Commission. It's called Generative Commons. And what you can see here in the maps is participative processes in which LGBTQ++, I'm sorry if I missed any of the letters there, they were working on what it's called collective emotional mapping to define different areas of how this vulnerable population perceive different areas of the city by, for instance, leisure zones or fear zones or the macho zones, for instance, or where are the freedom zones where they can really feel more safe. So they were actually working on this definition of what is the meaning of a safe space. Then they were rating the experience of the city, of the neighborhood. Then they moved to the city level, and then they compare themselves to other kind of cities. I think this is a good example of how you can, for instance, work with people. And I would invite to read. There is this tools for generative commons. It's quite interesting as an approach to work with the marginalized populations. And I'm coming to my conclusions.
Oh,
yeah,
great.
One last.
Okay, thank you.
I know about the timing. So some few conclusions about what I just presented. So marginalized communities may have some knowledge and practices that could be leveraged for building community resilience. So it's about engaging them. And I think this will be the topic of the next 2 speakers of today. I think it's important to invest in regenerating public spaces that could actually contribute to create more cohesion and strengthen informant networks. But this regeneration should be embedded in understanding the social dynamics. There is also the scale issue, which is very, very important. So we are talking about urban settings, territorial, regional, etc., etc. But we also need to think about sometimes micro interventions in the short term, but also anchored in macro urban or territorial schemes that are running in the long term. And finally, and not the least, I think it's a policymaker should work a bit more with robust insights on marginality. And I always like to bring this idea of Guy Peters that were saying policymakers should govern at street level. I know that I'm repeating over the last 2 years about this phrase, but I think it's very, very important that we need to understand how vulnerable population leave the cities, marginalized population leave the city if we want to change. So tackling causes, involving them into the co-design of the policies, but also avoiding to recreate vulnerabilities that would lead to maladaptation. So thank you very much, and then thank you for the extra minute, Eugenia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Matthias, and thank you also for bringing these case examples. It's very nice and useful. So for all the participants, we will have a question and answer session at the very end in the round table. But if you already have some questions triggered by this presentation, don't hesitate to write them down on the chat or using the Q&A button there on Teams. So we will continue now with our next speaker. Sofia Strid is an associate professor and director of research studies in the Department of Sociology and Work Science of the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and is the scientific coordinator of ACCTING project. She has worked extensively on developing concepts and methodologies for theorizing and measuring inequalities with a focus on violence, crisis, and sustainability. So we are thrilled to learn more from her knowledge and experience from the ACCTING project. And I will present and share now the screen and give the floor to Sofia.
Thank you very much, Eugenia, and good morning, everyone, and greetings from ACCTING. We're also a Horizon 2020 funded project. We're coordinated by the European Science Foundation in Strasbourg. We've run for 42 months, and we are about to embark on our last 6 months. So we'll have our final conference in Brussels on 3rd of April, 2025. So follow us on LinkedIn to catch up on the news on how to join that conference. I want us to have sort of 4 takeaways from what I'm about to say, spending the next 14 minutes saying. And that is something about the exclusion of multiple inequalities and intersectionality in different forms of crisis policy. I want us to remember that marginalized groups or vulnerable groups are not only passive victims of the green transition, they're also key drivers for change. I want us to see something or learn something about the policy relevance of enablers and barriers to accessing the green transition. And I want to say something about the insights on how to involve marginalized or vulnerable groups in the green transition. Next slide, please. So ACCTING conceptualizes the climate crisis as not only an ecological crisis, but it's also an economic crisis, a social crisis, and a political crisis with devastating impacts on all levels, on individuals, on families, collectives, economies, and whole society. And I think it's fair to say that it's well established and recognized by both the scientific and the policy communities that while both the impact of climate change and the political capacity to mitigate its negative effects impacts on all segments of society, they are not evenly distributed, neither across societies nor within societies. It is the poorer, marginalized, disadvantaged, sometimes called vulnerable groups, who are the most acutely affected. And it's not controversial to claim that climate change has significant gendered and intersectional impacts. So in a nutshell, the climate crisis exacerbates already existing gendered, socioeconomic and intersectional inequalities, and the policy responses to climate crisis tend to generate further inequalities because people are excluded from policies or they are unable to access or implement the measures required. So consequently, both the impacts of climate change and its policy responses are uneven, unequal, disproportionate for different social groups, and the long-term impacts are uncertain. So now we should be on the slide that we're on. Thanks, Virginia. No, you should be on the slide that you were on, the one with the 3 bullet points, 3 points. Thank you. So Acting argues that policy responses to climate change must consider gender plus intersectional input and outputs, so both causes and effects, in order to not leave some groups benefiting and others falling further behind. And yet, green policies, much like any crisis policy that is designed to address the mitigation and adaptation strategies, have largely failed to incorporate gender and other complex intersection inequalities. The EU-funded FUTURESILIENCE, which analysed inequalities in crisis policy related to COVID, showed that crisis policy fails doing this in 3 ways. First, policy does not address multiple inequalities, and never mind the intersection of these, either in preambles or in introductory paragraphs to policies. Second, marginalised groups do not have a seat at the policy negotiation table. They are excluded from decision-making on policies. And third, the policy consultation process, which can be formal or informal, but they do often not include the voices of marginalised groups, either in the informal or formal consultation process. Next slide, please. So we see this as a 2-layered problem, including a paradox then. So we know that marginalised groups are significantly more impacted by the climate crisis and its effect. But on the other hand, we know that marginalised and vulnerable groups are not only passive victims of the green transition, they are also the key drivers for change. So herein lies the paradox. Social groups and communities which are more exposed to diversified effects and risks of being damaged by climate change are often among the key actors for managing the climate transition, particularly when they form groups and networks to collectively address these issues. So it means a very obvious conclusion is that these groups need particular attention. Next slide, please. So this graph shows the results from the first cycle interviews that Acting did in 12 countries. It's about 400 interviews. The green are what we call enablers and the red are what we call hindrances. And what we found throughout, both in the first research cycle and in the second research cycle, is that the key barriers across all groups and Green Deal policy areas for a green transition on the individual level are structural. And the key enabler, again, across all groups and Green Deal policy areas for a green transition are resources and social dynamics. So we start with the barriers or hindrances. What prevents people from living more sustainably and sort of joining the green transition? This includes structural conditions such as geography and the environment, infrastructure, social and economic conditions, policies and politics, including local, national, European and global policies and politics, and various events and developments on local, national, European and global levels. And overall, the most common barrier for why change is impossible or very difficult is the combination of social and economic conditions and structural and political conditions. If we look at enablers for accessing or joining the green transition and changing your behavior to a more sustainable one, the individual resources, there were the key enablers were time, money, knowledge, access to equipment, access to political and social actors. And here I want you to remember access to political and social actors. In terms of social dynamics, the key enablers for the green transition are being part of a community or a social network, having significant relationships, trust, care, support, or leadership relationships, having certain beliefs or values, these can be religious, cultural, ideological, or political, and feelings of social appreciation. And here I want you to remember being part of a community or social network in particular. So, being part of a community or a social network is by far the strongest driver for individuals to change their behavior and live more sustainably. And this is important because it suggests that if we want to speed up a socially just and inclusive green transition, we need to strengthen our communities and the sense of belonging to a community, and we need to increase marginalized groups' access to political and social actors. And sociologists often use the concept of social capital to analyze how marginalized groups may empower themselves and develop action capacity by accessing the crucial resources needed for transformation change through their wider social networks. However, particularly vulnerable groups, as in marginalized and disadvantaged vulnerable groups, tend to have a disadvantage here. They are also socially vulnerable, meaning less able to mobilize material, social and emotional resources to cope with crisis. So we seem to have another paradox here in terms of social capital, here understood as the capacity to engage in community, being part of social networks and having access to political and social actors. These are key for marginalized groups to change their behavior to a more sustainable one and join in the green transition. But at the same time, these are the key characteristics of being marginalized. I mean, lacking these two resources. And to complicate this slightly further, there are further inequalities within the marginalized groups to access the green transition. So it's not even evenly spread within the marginalized groups. Socioeconomic background is the most notable inequality when it comes to accessing resources to change your behavior and join the green transition. Geographic location is the second most important inequality. Age and gender are also relatively strong. Ethnic origin and disability emerge sporadically in our analysis, and remaining often quoted inequalities seldom arise as significant in our research. That is gender identity, nationality, religion, or sexual orientation. Next slide, please. So for us, then the question is, when does this work? When can marginalized groups access the social dynamics and structural conditions needed in order to change your behavior to a more sustainable one and accessing, joining, being part of the green transition? We analyze a set of inspiring practices and change on the ground. So local bottom-up initiatives that were often the initiative of vulnerable groups or marginalized groups. And based on these data, Acting produced or are producing a set of fact sheets with evidence-based recommendations to support policymakers, employers, and civil society organizations in understanding the effects of Green Deal policies on marginalized groups and to suggest practical recommendations to mitigate these. And I want to talk about one particular fact sheet in the last 3-4 minutes that I have. And it's about civil society and how civil society can support us here. And I want to thank the co-authors of this fact sheet. It's Anna Vivas from SARC, Esin Düssel from Sabanci University Gender, Ayşegül Altanay, also from Sabanci University in the Gender Unit, and then Burcu Boran, also at Sabanci, and Marina Kakashi at KNI. So we saw that community and social networks plus access to political and social actors are key for inclusion. And here we argue that non-governmental organizations play a key role in the formation and implementation of Green Deal policies in relation to social networks and access to political and social actors. They hold the expertise on climate change, environmental issues, social justice, and sustainable development issues. They work on the ground, locally, and often in solidarity with local communities, with and for vulnerable groups, representing their voices and interests. And it's also shown by previous research that NGOs enjoy more public trust than governments, corporations, and the media. So NGOs' participation in climate change negotiations is significant. They can provide policymakers and decision makers with expertise, they provide legitimacy to environmental governments, and they provide a way for marginalized groups to be included and have access to political actors. However, there's always a problem, and that is that not all NGOs obviously are not successful in embedding democratic legitimacy in organizations and actions, or a diversity in their governance structures, or they might not even be accountable to the members that they are meant to represent, that there are no structures for this accountability. And here we argue that for the green transition to be just and inclusive, and for NGOs to be able to play this role, is crucial that they are inclusive and that they fully reflect the diversity of sort of their, I'm waving my hands in citation marks here, their groups. But what we found in the analysis of nearly 700 bottom-up initiatives was that only a quarter of the initiatives went into processes of decision-making together with local authorities and generated some sort of bilateral consensus building. Less than half of them worked within a framework of multilateral identification of responsibilities, sharing leadership and accountability with other social actors in the field. And here then the key thing to remember is that the analysis of our interviews revealed that a sense of community belonging is a key enabler for change towards environmentally friendly behavior. So if that's the key enabler, if civil society can manage to negotiate and represent the interests of marginalized groups into policy and into policy making. And if civil society then is not accountable, if they are not sharing leadership, and if they are not representing the interests of their groups, this role falls and becomes unlegitimate. Last 2 minutes. I can go to the last slide, Eugenia. Or the second last slide, I think. Thank you. A bit quickly wrapping up. Why do we need intersectionality at the core of inclusive green policies? I go back to traditional social theory and philosophy and looking at different types of arguments for why interests should be represented. First, there's the old school, almost Kantian argument that it's a matter of a priori rights. People should be included. They have a right to be included. All groups' voices should be heard and represented. And this is also a justice as fairness argument. Second, because marginalized groups are the key actors of change, not including them in the work is simply a waste of resources. So here we have a utilitarian argument about waste of resources and the consequences. And then third, there are political interests and voices based on belonging to specific groups, and groups are oppressed or excluded based on certain interests. Therefore, they also have an interest to be represented as that group in policymaking. And this is an interest argument, or also coming from feminist standpoint theory, or feminist theory. So to conclude with the very outset that we had at this webinar, in order to build resilient societies, actions have to be focused on the most affected and the most vulnerable. Involving vulnerable groups in defining adaptation approaches and finding solutions strengthen their capacities and also helps to build inclusive societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. And we invite everyone to have a look at ACCTING results. As Sophia mentioned, it's the very end of the project, so we have a lot to show. Now we will give the floor to our last speaker. Johannes Klein is a senior researcher at Demos Helsinki in Finland and a partner of the Regions for Climate project. Johannes is an experienced climate change adaptation researcher specialized in the governance of adaptation in urban and regional context, focusing on creating sustainable and resilient communities. With a background as an environmental engineer and a Doctor of Science in Land Use Planning and Urban Studies, he brings a strong academic foundation to his work and is passionate about just, transformative, and inclusive adaptation action. So we look forward to hearing his valuable perspectives today, and I give now the floor to Johannes. You're muted, Johannes.
Thanks. Now, well, Eugenia, thanks for noticing that I'm muted. Thanks for the nice introduction. So how to identify and engage vulnerable and marginalized groups was the original title. I realized, seeing Matthias' presentation and Sophia's presentation, I added then in building climate resilience because, well, it's again a specific angle on the issue. I'm representing Regions for Climate, which is a Horizon-funded project under the EU adaptation mission with the aim to build socially just transition to climate resilience. And so this is the angle I take, and I think it extends well the previous presentations. We will see some overlap, but also it goes maybe in some points a step further. And I try to be as little theoretical as possible, which is maybe difficult, but also have practical advice for how to do what I promised here, the identification and involvement of marginalized and vulnerable groups. So I'll do this along these 4 questions. First, again, which you heard previously, but let's see if you can see something new in my take on it, on the question, who is vulnerable? Then the question, how do we identify this? This is a very practical take on it. How to get these groups or people on board, and then in the process, how can we ensure that their needs are actually recognized? Let's go into it. There's a lot of text, but I'll run you through it. So when you are at home in the climate change community, as I am very much, then the first definition of vulnerability is probably most familiar to you, the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected. This is nice, but what we are missing, we don't know who or what is affected. So it can be a system, a city, for example, as a whole. It can be an ecosystem. It can be the economy, but actually here we are talking about people, so we have to look at it in a little bit different way. And depending how we conceptualize vulnerability, it also has an influence on what we potentially are going to do. So I picked here 3 different takes on it. If we understand vulnerability as an innate characteristic of a person, whatever that is, like age or illness might be a typical example, then it's something that we cannot really change much about it. So any action that we are taking is probably rather protective and not really dealing with the vulnerability as such. Situational vulnerability means that people have experienced our experience specific situations, that they are victims of violence, or that they are currently homeless, or, and this is interesting, that they are exposed, for example, to climate change. And that's important to notice, because when you talk to climate change people nowadays, exposure is not part of the vulnerability. So you have to have some mental flexibility when you talk about vulnerability, what is part of it and what not. Or then what we heard from Matthias already, structural vulnerability. So of course, it's a societal context. What kind of role, what kind of position a person or a group has some effect on the vulnerability. Having this in mind and not talking about vulnerability broadly, but having an idea from what type, from what angle we are looking at it, then comes the question, how do we identify the vulnerable groups? And since we are talking here about building climate resilience, we have to take a certain angle on it, a certain look, and that's why I put here the IPCC risk framework and its most recent edition, so to say. And basically, we have to intersect the vulnerability with climate change. So we have to see, okay, we have a vulnerable group that is exposed either to a climatic hazard or to long-term climate change, or also to the responses to climate change, which might be either, of course, any type of adaptation, or, as we heard in the previous presentation, for example, green transition. And this is basically this intersection. At this point, we try to look, at least here in Regions for Climate. We translated that into 2 rather simple tables as supporting a thought tool, so to say, and I will give from each one example. Because when we want to engage the vulnerable groups, it doesn't help to know, okay, we have to talk about old people or migrants or whatever, because we still don't know whom we want to have at the table. So here, the first example, people working outdoors are potentially vulnerable because of their working conditions. If they are exposed to climate change, let's say, for example, in prolonged and more frequent heat waves, then we have the exposure that the people work outdoors, they're exposed to sun and heat and might suffer health issues related to that. So whom do we want to have then participating if we take this look at it? So people working in construction, agriculture, horticulture, for example. Since in Regions for Climate, we are working at the regional level, it might be tricky to get actual persons, but we might have organizations representing them. And here our suggestion would be, for example, labor unions. And once we have these, we might have a contact person that we can contact and say, hey, could you please, or could we work together on building climate resilience? The other part, vulnerability, you can be also vulnerable to climate change adaptation, which sounds weird, but nevertheless, it is there. For example, flood risk insurance is often used as an example as an adaptation action. On the one hand, it should spread the financial risks via the insurance, and on the other hand, via the premium that people pay. And if it's getting too high, it should motivate people to move out of flood-prone areas. But if this is then combined with the socioeconomic situation of people, if you have currently a precarious situation, for example, you might be trapped in a house in a flood-prone area. You cannot move away, but you cannot afford the insurance premium either. So you have homeowners with limited financial resources in areas with increasing flood hazard, for example. So once we've run this through, and we might have an idea whom we want to have on board, and I didn't touch here, for example, on intersectionality yet, but then how do we actually get them on board if we have some participatory event? Here are 5 guidelines. These are not our inventions. Other smart people did that before us, but nevertheless, we consider them fairly useful to keep in mind. So the first thing should be self-evident for any kind of workshop participatory process you run, no matter whom you want to get on board. You have to have enough time and money and resources to do that. So you need it for preparation, for the marketing, as we did with this webinar. You have to have sound background information. You have to make sure that you can have the physical facilities, the catering, and also for the documentation and analysis. Then you have to be clear. Why do you want to have somebody on board? So you have to be clear about what the participants can influence and what they cannot influence, and what they what they can get out of it. This is important because if you're not clear about it, first, people might not show up, and second, if you're not clear about it, they might be very disappointed at the end of the event if they don't have the influence that we're expecting to have. Then also you have to be very clear about, okay, we have an engagement process, what happens with the results, who is accountable, what is happening with the results. And then at the event itself, it has to be accessible. This is really important, especially for marginalized and vulnerable groups. So this is not about only the physical access. This is accessibility. This is one point, but you might also think about the language that you use, compensation for the participation, because, well, this is a matter of respect simply because you are using people's time and knowledge, and so it should be a possibility to get compensation if it's needed, or for example, childcare might something to offer. And then also you should plan ahead what happens with the information, like how do you collect it, what you want to get out of it, how to collect feedback, and also to respect the privacy rights. Having all that, hopefully you get your people on board, but then remains the last question that I wanted to address. How can we ensure then that we actually are recognizing the needs? These 5 bubbles, you don't have to pay too much attention to it. That's a different topic. So this is our just a transition framework towards climate resilience. That was one of the deliverables in Regions for Climate. And along these 5 bubbles, they are now at the column on the left. So we switched it by 90 degrees. We came up with a set of questions that are good to ask ourselves in between. And here we categorized them according for the four dimensions, according to 4 dimensions of social justice. For example, in the preparation, scope and context building, the question is what kind of material, what kind of background material do you use for your participatory event workshop? For example, when you try to map areas, or let's say also infrastructure that might be affected by climate change and hence affecting also people. If you use only highways as an indicator, you are basically neglecting people that are walking or cycling. So think about how your background information is representing vulnerable and marginalized groups. And then when you have the event, this comes very much back to the kind of 5 guidelines before. When you have an actual event, here in this case, it's also kind of a foresight process with building a vision and then defining action in a actions in a backcasting process. Also here, you have to make sure that they have a equitable and transparent process, that you take into account potential structural barrier for participation, and also then that you avoid jargon, that you make it accessible in all the ways I pointed out previously, and that you don't run any kind of hidden agenda in this kind of participatory event. Or finally, how to identify the actors to involve. This is related here to restorative justice, that it's also important here exactly to look at the structural conditions that render people vulnerable, so potential social, cultural, political, economic factors that might render people vulnerable. If we have all that, if we would have done all this in our workshops, it would be perfect, almost. Therefore, I bring at the end 2 practical examples still, and they look rather boring. They look like typical workshops, and they've been practical workshops, just typical workshops. But what have we done? On the left side, there was a risk prioritization workshop in Uusimaa in Finland. This was actually not really a Regions for Climate workshop, but we fed in some information. Here we did this mapping of potentially vulnerable groups. We identified a list of organizations and people that could represent them. We came up with 14 or 17 names. They were invited to participate. 2 representatives showed up. So here we have to do our homeworks and check, okay, how can we justify that these groups should be represented here, and what can they get out of the event? Because obviously this was not totally clear. The other one then on the right-hand side, was an actual Regions for Climate workshop on the Azores run by our colleagues there, related to the Just Transition roadmaps. And here, again, did we get the vulnerable groups on board? It's a definite maybe. So it was integrated basically in the scope that we took there. So we said we look at the impacts of climate change, specifically on the primary sector, agriculture and fishery. Are these people vulnerable? Yeah, that can be justified because they are, of course, specifically exposed to the weather elements like droughts, heat, water shortage are important issues, but that at the same time, they are also competing for certain resources with other sectors, like, for example, tourism. Housing is an issue and water supply is an issue. So here we had representatives of these groups here, and they were working on a joint vision for climate resilient Azores. So as you see, the practical implementation might look boring, but I hope that that the recommendations that we presented, that the groundwork that you can do in preparation and after the workshop, that this helps to really to get vulnerable and marginalized groups represented and on board. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for your presentation and for keeping also the time. It was very interesting to know what Regions for Climate have done in this checklist on how to ensure that vulnerable needs are recognized in the actions. Now we have time for the roundtable discussion. This will be moderated by my 2 colleagues, Antti Tahvanainen and Joanna Varabusila, that are also science officers at the European Science Foundation and part of the acting coordination team. So I will give you now the opportunity to moderate the roundtable. And of course, if you have questions, please write them down on the chat.
Thank you, Eugenia, and thank you for the panelists for these very interesting presentations. They are all very relevant and insightful. So thank you very much for this inspiring insights. We already have a question in the chat. Ron, would you like to address it, or should I just read it? Maybe I can go ahead to save some time. As an ethics advisor to several projects, including Future Resilience for research purposes, we should not be asking, are these subjects vulnerable? Instead, the ethical question is, are these subjects made any more vulnerable than they might ordinarily be in their daily lives as a result of their participation in this research. For example, people might not perceive themselves as vulnerable until the research comes along. With climate change, the raising of awareness can introduce anxiety, fear, and even panic. And I could add here that from my experience, there is movement claiming that these kind of vulnerabilities are being politically maintained. So, Sophia, maybe you have your hand raised.
I'm very eager to jump in here.
Yeah.
I'm just so in terms of the sort of ethics issue that we're always dealing with in this type of projects is that we have to pass through, at least in our case, the Swedish National Ethics Review Authority, where we have to outline and define the consequences, the potential negative consequences and the potential positive consequences of conducting the research. And if the negative consequences outweigh the potential positive consequences of the people we involve in the research, we do not pass the ethics review. So but that's just sort of, that's administrative in one sense. The real problem, I think, first of all, I absolutely despise the concept of vulnerability in so many ways, but I feel like we have bowed down to the European Commission's use of it. It is what is in every work program, so we're using it, but I'd much rather keep using, at-risk groups or marginalized groups or relatively disadvantaged groups. Because as I said, these groups are not just passive victims, they are key drivers of change. They have agency, they have resources, and they just sometimes need to access structural conditions to mobilize those resources. We mustn't forget that we're talking about vulnerable groups, but they're not, they have resources and knowledge and agency to act, and we need them to be part of the, anyway. And do I have another minute or should I leave? I could go on about this forever. Yeah, okay, thank you. So what we try and do in acting, and what we've also done in the previous project, the Sistere that I talked about, is to focus on, the inspiring practices, the positive examples, the better stories that we borrow from Dina George's, her concept of better story, which basically says that, the better stories of policies or civil society initiatives, they're not a perfect fix, but they illustrate how a given social situation can be improved. And we use this concept in co-creation with representatives of groups and sometimes directly marginalized people or decision makers in our workshops and in our open studios. So they're called open studios. So we really try and involve these groups, both in the form and in the content of the research that we do. I think I'll leave it there. I've talked too much. Thank you.
Thank you. Matthias or Johannes, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, maybe a brief comment. So maybe we can also, of course, differentiate whether we use vulnerability as like an analytical term and vehicle, and how we well, we can use it as this, or we can even use it like to stigmatize groups, and then of course that's not our aim. Of course, with respect, for example, to Regions for Climate and probably also to the other project, it's a little bit a two-folded thing, or two sides of the coins, because they are not purely research projects. They are expected to have directly some positive impacts, but of course it's clear the idea should not be we are to exploit people and to get information out purely, but that's what I said also previous. You have to justify that, why you want to get them important, what they get out of it.
Of course.
If I may step in, and I can also bring some of the other questions that are there. So here I may twist a bit also with some personal opinion, and I think it's good that I made this disclaimer. I think there is an importance of also giving some visibility to some groups, but this is not, so there is the risk of labeling them, but I think still there is a need for policymakers to understand that there are different. And here I will make this disclaimer, because also there is this comment in the chat from Epu, says perhaps person in vulnerable positions, or then he says groups is a problematic in its assumed homogeneity, and I think the UN uses person situations. And I agree with that. So there is a need to really differentiate who we are talking about, both for NGOs, both for policymakers. And I also put a question, and I want to bring it back if there is still time to Sophia and Johannes, in your experience. There is also this long-standing issue, how to avoid using these vulnerable people and also the non-vulnerable ones in research and co-creation purposes once and again. So we keep going using them in labs, and then what's out of that? So have you developed any experience on how to avoid that, or you have any thought about that?
Sorry, Matthias, could you repeat the question? I was so focused on Crenshaw's dilemma in the chat, so I didn't.
Sure. So it was about if you have developed any experience or you have any conclusion about how to avoid using and, let's say, somehow abusing of going to the same group by different type of institutions to do research and co-creation processes again and again and again, and sometimes there is no output out of that, but just collecting information or debating with them, and that actually keeps labeling them as vulnerable without getting them even out of the situation eventually.
My sort of gut reaction would be to always make sure that you have diversity in your research and innovation projects, so you don't always go to the same groups, the same people to collect information, so that we ourselves represent different groups and not just the homogeneous usual suspects in the setup of our projects. Another way that we work with this is to have networks of national researchers working in multiple countries. So in a previous project, we had it in 27 countries, so 27 different people doing the interview. So it's not the core partner with so like I said, the usual suspects are doing this and gathering the information. It's sort of outsourced to a wide variety of researchers. That would be my two ways of trying to deal with this.
Well, I can talk about it with respect to Regions for Climate, and I think here the point is that no matter whether we talk about vulnerable groups or anybody who participates in the project or contributes to it, that we shouldn't see people purely as knowledge generators or input providers, but we have to make clear what happens with the contribution, and where does it feed back into the policy process? Where is it taken up in the end? So, and then also we should make sure that only if we really can justify a need to get them on board, that we only do it then, and not simply for the purpose of collecting more information or more knowledge for our research.
Well, thank you very much for bringing in this discussion. I think also in the chat there was a lot of parallel discussion. Now we have run out of time, but it's clear the need of this type of webinars to discuss these topics that are relevant for several projects. So thank you again to all the speakers for your insights and the discussions and all the organizing team of the webinar. And for the attendees, we will share the video recording of this webinar in case you want to re-look at it or share it with other of your colleagues. So thank you very much, and I hope you have all enjoyed very much as we did. Bye bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.